Chapter 5, About Guppies and Chupwalas. Haroun had not forgotten what his father had said about Haroun Ch. Too many fancy notions are turning out to be true, he thought. At once But the Hoopoe answered without moving its beak. A strange sort of story moon our Kahani would be if storybook things weren't everywhere to be found. And Haroun had to admit that was a reasonable remark. They were speeding south to Gup City. The Hoopoe had chosen to remain on the water, zooming along like a speedboat, spraying story streams in every direction. "Doesn't it muddle up the stories?" Haroun inquired. "All this turbulence? It must mix things up dreadfully." "No problem," cried But the Hoopoe. "Any story worth its salt can handle a little shaken up. Va-voom!" Abandoning what was clearly not a profitable line of conversation, Haroun returned to more important matters. "Tell me more about this Haroun Ch," he requested, and was utterly amazed when If replied in almost the very same words that Rashid Khalifa had used. "He is the arch-enemy of all stories, even of language itself. He is the prince of silence and the foe of speech. At least." And here the water genie abandoned the somewhat too sonorous tone of the preceding sentences. "That's what they say. And when it comes to the land of Chup and its people, the Chupwalas, it's all mostly gossip and flim-flam, because it's generations since any of us went across the twilight strip into the perpetual night." "You'll have to forgive me," Haroun broke in, "but I'm going to need a little help with the geography." "Humph," sniffed But the Hoopoe. "Poorly educated, I see." "That's totally illogical," Haroun retorted. "You're the one who's been boasting about how speed has hidden this moon from people on Earth. So it's unreasonable to expect us to know about its topographical features, principal exports, and the like." But But's eye was twinkling. Really, there were major difficulties involved in talking to machines, Haroun thought. With their deadpan expressions, it was impossible to know when they were pulling your leg. "Thanks to the geniuses of the eggheads at P2C2E House," Butt began, taking pity on Haroun, "the rotation of Kahani has been brought under control. As a result, the land of Gup is bathed in endless sunshine, while over in Chup, it's always the middle of the night. In between the two lies the twilight strip, in which the Grand Comptroller's command. At the Grand Comptroller's command, Guppies long ago constructed an unbreakable and also invisible wall of force. Its good name is Chatterjee's Wall, named after our king, who of course had absolutely nothing to do with building it." "Hold on a minute," Haroun frowned. "If Kahani goes round the Earth, even if it goes very fast indeed, there must be moments when the Earth is between it and the sun. So it can't be true that one half is always in the daylight. You're telling stories again." "Naturally I am telling stories," But the Hoopoe replied, "and if you have any arguments, please take them up with the walrus. Now, excuse, please, while I pay attention ahead. Volume of traffic has dramatically increased." Haroun had plenty more questions to ask. Why did the Chupwalas live in permanent night? Must it not be very cold indeed if the sun never shone at all? And what was Bezaban or a cult master come to that? But they were evidently nearing Gup City because the waters around them and the skies above them were filling up with mechanical birds every bit as fanciful as But the Hoopoe. Birds with snake heads and peacock tails, flying fishes, dog birds, and on the backs of the birds were water genies with whiskers of every possible hue, all wearing turbans and embroidered waistcoats and aubergine-shaped pants, and all looking so much like If that it was a good thing in Haroun's opinion, that the colors of their whiskers were different enough to make it possible to tell them apart. "Something most serious has occurred," If commented. "All units have been ordered back to base. Now, if I had my disconnecting tool," he added sharply, "I would have received the order myself because as of course thieflets do not know, there is a highly advanced transceiver built into the handle." "Luckily, however," Haroun came back just as sharply, "since you have poisoned me with that dirty story, you worked things out, so there's no harm done, except perhaps to me." If ignored this, and Haroun's attention was distracted as well because he noticed that a large patch of what looked like a particularly thick and rough type of weed or vegetable of some sort was actually racing along right beside them, keeping pace with But the Hoopoe without apparent effort, while it waved vegetable tentacles in the air in a most disturbing fashion. At the center of the mobile vegetable patch was a single lilac flower with thick, fleshy leaves, of a type that Haroun had never seen before. "What's that?" he inquired, pointing, even though he knew it was impolite to do so. A floating gardener, naturally," said Butt the Hoopoe without moving its beak. That made no sense. "You mean a floating garden," Haroun corrected the bird, which gave a little snort. "It's all you know," it harumphed. At that moment, the high-speed vegetation actually reared up out of the water and proceeded to wind and knot itself around and about until it had taken something like the shape of a man, with the lilac-colored flower positioned as its head, where a mouth should be, and a cluster of weeds forming a rustic-looking hat. So it is a floating gardener after all, Haroun realized. The floating gardener was now running lightly over the surface of the water, showing no signs of sinking. "How could he sink?" Butt the Hoopoe interjected. "Would he not be a sinking gardener in that case? Whereas as you observe, he floats, he runs, he walks, he hops. No problem." If called across to the gardener, who at once nodded a brief greeting. "Got a stranger with you. Very odd. Still, your own business," he said. His voice was as soft as flower petals. After all, he was actually speaking through those lilac lips. But his manner was somewhat abrupt. "I thought all you guppies were chatterboxes," Haroun whispered to If, "but this gardener doesn't say much." "He is talkative," If rejoined, "for a gardener anyhow." "How do you do?" Haroun called across to the gardener, thinking that as he was the stranger, it was his business to introduce himself. "Who are you?" the gardener asked in his soft but abrupt way, without breaking his stride. Haroun told him his name, and the gardener gave another curt nod. "Molly," he said. "Floating gardener, first class." "Please," said Haroun in his nicest voice, "what does a floating gardener do?" "Maintenance," answered Molly, untwisting twisted story streams, and unlooping same, weeding, in short, gardening. "Think of the ocean as a head of hair," said Butt the Hoopoe helpfully. "Imagine it's as full of story streams as a thick mane is full of soft flowing strands. The longer and thicker a head of hair, the knottier and more tangled it gets. Floating gardeners, as you say, are like the hairdressers of the sea of stories. Brush, clean, wash, condition. So now you know." If asked Molly, "What's this pollution? When did it start? How bad is it?" Molly answered the question in sequence. "Lethal, but nature as yet unknown. Started only recently, but spread is very rapid. How bad? Very bad. Certain types of story may take years to clean up." "For example," Haroun piped up, "certain popular romances have become just long lists of shopping expeditions. Children's stories also. For instance, there is an outbreak of talking helicopter anecdotes." With that, Molly fell silent, and the rush to Gup City continued. A few minutes later, however, Haroun heard more new voices. They were like choruses, many voices at a time speaking in perfect unison, and they were full of froth and bubbles. Finally, Haroun worked out that they were actually coming up from beneath the surface of the ocean. He looked down into the waters and saw two fearsome sea monsters right beside the racing Hoopoe, swimming so close to the surface that they were almost surfing on the spray thrown up by Butt as it sped along. From their roughly triangular shape and their iridescent coloring, Haroun deduced that they were angelfish of some variety, though they were as big as giant sharks and had literally dozens of mouths all over their bodies. These mouths were constantly at work, sucking in story streams and blowing them out again, pausing only to speak. When they did so, Haroun noticed, each mouth spoke with its own voice. But all the mouths on each individual fish spoke perfectly synchronized words. "Hurry, hurry, don't be late," bubbled the first fish. "Ocean's ailing, cure can't wait," the second went on. But the Hoopoe was once again kind enough to enlighten Haroun. "These are the plenty-maw fish," it said. They acquire their good name from the fact that you have no doubt registered that they have plenty of maws, i.e., mouths. So, thought Haroun, filled with wonder, there really are plenty more fish in the sea. Just as old Sooty Batu said. And I have traveled a long way, just as my father said, and I've learned that a plenty more fish can be an angelfish as well. Plenty more fishes always go in twos, but added without moving its beak, they are faithful to partners for life. To express this perfect unison, they speak, only and always, in rhyme. These particular plenty more fish seemed unhealthy to Haroun. Their multiple mouths frequently spluttered and coughed, and their eyes looked inflamed and pink. I'm no expert, Haroun called to them, but are you both quite well? The replies came swiftly, punctuated by bubbling coughs. All in bad taste. Too much dirt. Swimming in the ocean starts to hurt. Call me Baga. This is Goopy. Excuse our rudeness. We feel droopy. Eyes feel roomy, throat feels sore. When we're better, we'll talk more. As you correctly guessed, all guppies love to talk, if said in an aside. Silence is often considered rude, hence the Plenty Maw's apology. They seem to be talking okay to me, Haroun replied. Normally, each mouth says something different, if explained. That makes plenty more talk. For them, this is like silence. Whereas for a floating gardener, a few short sentences are called talkativeness. Haroun sighed. I don't think I'll ever get the hang of this place. What did the fish do, anyway? If replied, the Plenty Maw fish were what he called hunger artists, because when they were hungry, they swallowed stories through every mouth, and in their innards, miracles occurred. A little bit of one story joins on to an idea from another, and hey, presto! When they spew the stories out, they are not old tales, but new ones. Nothing comes from nothing, Thieflet. No story comes from nowhere. New stories are born from old. It is the new combinations that make them new. So you see, our artistic Plenty Maw fishes really create new stories in their digestive systems. So just think how sick they must be feeling now. All these filthied up sagas passing through their innards front to back, top to bottom, side to side. No wonder they look green about the gills. The Plenty Maw surfaced to utter one more wheezy couplet. Things are worse than we've ever known. And the worst place is down in our old zone. On hearing this, the water genie clapped his hand to his forehead, almost dislodging his turban. What? Haroun insisted on knowing, and so a now even more preoccupied If grudgingly explained that the old zone, in the southern polar region of Kahani, was an area to which hardly anybody went anymore. There was little demand for the ancient stories flowing there. You know how people are. New things, always new. The old tales, nobody cares. So the old zone had fallen into disuse. But it was believed that all the streams of stories had originated long ago in one of the currents flowing north across the ocean from the wellspring, or source of stories, that was located, according to legend, near the moon's south pole. And if the source itself is poisoned, what will happen to the ocean, to all of us? If almost wailed, we have ignored it for too long and now we pay the price. Hold on to hats, but the hoopoe interrupted, hitting the brake now. Gup City dead ahead, record time, va-va-va-voom, no problem. It's amazing what you can get accustomed to, and at what speed, Haroun reflected. This new world, these new friends, have just arrived, and already none of it seems very strange at all. Gup City was all excitement and activity. Waterways crisscrossed the city in all directions, for the capital of the land of Gup was built upon an archipelago of 1,001 small islands just off the mainland. And at present, these waterways thronged with craft of every shape and size, all packed with Guppy citizens who were similarly diverse and who all wore worried expressions on their faces. But the hoopoe, with Molly on one side and Goopy and Baga on the other, advanced, more slowly now, through this floating crowd, heading, like everyone else, for the lagoon. The lagoon, a beautiful expanse of multicolored waters, stood between the archipelago, where most guppies made their homes in intricately carved wooden buildings, with roofs of corrugated silver and gold, and the mainland, where a gigantic formal garden came down in terraces right to the water's edge. In this pleasure garden were fountains and pleasure domes and ancient spreading trees, and around it were the three most important buildings in Gup, which looked like a trio of gigantic and elaborately iced cakes. The palace of King Chatterjee, with its grand balcony overlooking the garden. To its right, the Parliament of Gup, known as the Chatterbox, because the debates there could run on for weeks or months, even occasionally years, on account of the Guppy fondness for conversation. And to its left, the towering edifice of P2C2E House, a huge building from which whirs and clanks were constantly heard, and inside which were concealed 1001 machines too complicated to describe, which controlled the processes too complicated to explain. But the hoopoe brought If and Haroun to the steps at the water's edge. The boy and the water genie disembarked and joined the throng gathering in the pleasure garden. For while those guppies who preferred the water, floating gardeners, plenty more fishes, mechanical birds, remained in the lagoon. In the pleasure garden, Haroun noticed large numbers of guppies, of an extraordinary thinness, dressed in entirely rectangular garments, covered in writing. Those, If told him, are the famous pages of Gup, that is to say, the army. Ordinary armies are made up of platoons and regiments and such like. Our pages are organized into chapters and volumes. Each volume is headed by a front or title page, and up there is the leader of the entire library, which is our name for the army, General Katab himself. Up there was the balcony of the Palace of Gup, on which the city's dignitaries were now assembling. It was easy to identify General Katab, a weather-beaten old gent with a rectangular uniform made of finely tooled gold inlay leather, of the sort Haroun had sometimes seen on the covers of old and valuable books. Then there was the speaker, that is the leader of the Chatterbox, a plump fellow who was even now talking unstoppably to his colleagues on the balcony, and a frail, small, white-haired gentleman wearing a circlet of gold and a tragic look. This was presumably King Chatterjee himself. The last two figures on the balcony were harder for Haroun to identify. There was a young fellow, and at present extremely worked-up fellow, with a dashing but somehow foolish look to him. Prince Bolo, the fiancé of King Chatterjee's only child, his daughter, the Princess Batsheet, If whispered to Haroun. And lastly, a person with a hairless head of quite spectacular smoothness and shininess, bearing on his upper lip a disappointingly insignificant mustache that looked like a piece of dead mouse. "He reminds me of Snooty Batu," Haroun whispered to If. "Never mind, nobody you know. But who is this fellow?" In spite of whispering, he was overheard by many of the people now crowding together in the full pleasure garden. They turned in disbelief to inspect this stranger whose ignorance was so remarkable, and whose nightshirt was equally unusual. And Haroun noticed that among the crowd were many men and women who, like the man on the balcony, had smooth, shiny, and hairless heads. These people all wore white coats of laboratory technicians, and were, clearly, the eggheads of P2C2E House, the geniuses who operated the machines too complicated to describe, or M2C2Ds, which made possible the processes too complicated to explain. "Are you?" he began, and they interrupted him. For being eggheads, they were extremely quick on the uptake. "We're the eggheads," they nodded. And then, with looks on their faces that said, "Oh, we can't believe you don't know this," they pointed at the shiny fellow on the grand balcony and said, "He is the walrus." "He's the walrus?" Haroun burst out, astounded. "But he's nothing like a walrus. Why do you call him that?" Ah, it's on account of his thick, luxuriant walrus mustache, one of the eggheads replied, and another added admiringly, "Oh, look at it. Isn't it the best? So hairy, so silky smooth." "But," Haroun began, and then stopped when If dug him hard in the ribs. "I suppose if you're as hairless as these eggheads," he told himself. "Even that pathetic dead mouse on the walrus's upper lip looks like the greatest thing you've ever seen." King Chatterjee raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. An unusual event in Gup City. The king attempted to speak, but words failed him, and shaking his head unhappily, he stepped back. It was Prince Bolo who burst into impetuous speech. "They have seized her!" he cried in his dashing, foolish voice. "My Batsheet, my princess! The servants of the cult-master purloined her some hours back. Churls, dastards, varlets, hounds! By gum, they will pay for this!" General Kitab took up the story. "A blasted business, confounded. Her whereabouts are not known, but most probably she will be kept prisoner in the citadel of Chup, the ice castle of Haroun Ch in Chup City, at the heart of the perpetual night. Spots and fogs, a bad business, humph." "We have sent messages to the cult master Haroun Ch," continued the speaker of the chatterbox. "These messages concern both the vile poison being injected into the ocean of streams of story and the abduction of Princess Batsheet. We demand that he put a stop to the pollution and also return within 7 hours the kidnapped lady. Neither demand has been met. I have to inform you, therefore, that a state of war now exists between the lands of Gup and Chup." "Extreme urgency is of the essence," the walrus told the crowd. "The poisons that are spreading so rapidly will destroy the entire ocean if steps are not taken to get to the bottom of the problem." "Save the ocean!" cried the crowd. "Save Batsheet!" shouted Prince Bolo. This confused the crowd for a few moments. Then, good-naturedly, they altered their cry. "For Batsheet and the ocean!" they exclaimed. And Prince Bolo looked satisfied enough with that. If the water genie put on his most winning expression. "Well, now it's war, young thieflet," he said with mocking regret. "That means nobody at P2C2E House will have any time for your little request. You may as well hand back that disconnecting tool then. What do you say? I'll have you taken home for nothing, completely free. There, what could be fairer than that?" Haroun clutched the disconnector with all his might and stuck out his lower lip mutinously. "No walrus, no disconnector," he said, "and that's flat." If appeared to accept this philosophically. "Have a chocolate," he said, and produced from one of his many waistcoat pockets a jumbo-sized version of Haroun's favorite chocolate bar. Realizing that he was starving hungry, Haroun gratefully accepted. "I didn't know you made these here on Kahani," he said. "We don't," If replied. "Food production on Kahani is strictly basic. For tasty and wicked luxury items, we have to go to Earth." "So this is where the unidentified flying objects come from," Haroun marveled. "And that's what they've been after. Snacks!" Just then there was a small commotion on the palace balcony. Prince Bolo and General Kitab went inside for a moment, then returned to announce that guppy patrols who had entered the outlying areas of the Twilight Strip, looking for clues to the whereabouts of the Princess Batsheet, had arrested a stranger, a highly suspicious person who could give no satisfactory account of himself or explain what he was doing in the strip. "I will question the spy before you all, myself," shouted Bolo. And though General Kitab looked a little embarrassed by that idea, he did not argue. Now a quartet of pages led the man onto the balcony. A man wearing a long blue nightshirt, with his hands tied behind his back and a sack over his head. When the sack was removed, Haroun's mouth fell open, and the unfinished chocolate bar fell from his hand. The man standing and shivering on the palace balcony, between Prince Bolo and General Kitab, was Haroun's father, Rashid Khalifa the storyteller, the unhappy Shah of Blah.